Aboard a luxury flight soaring high above the clouds, a quiet storm is brewing, one fueled not by turbulence, but by prejudice, power, and silent cruelty. An elderly black man, dressed simply yet carrying the weight of a lifetime in his calm eyes, steps into a world that should welcome him, only to find himself isolated by invisible walls and whispered judgments. As subtle acts of exclusion escalate into calculated humiliation, a truth lies hidden beneath the surface, one that will shatter assumptions and upend the entire flight. What happens when the passenger everyone tries to erase turns out to hold the key to a reckoning no one saw coming? Stay with us for this gripping journey of injustice, resilience, and an unforgettable revelation. If this kind of story captivates you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Tell us where you're watching from and what you think about the unfolding drama. We want to hear your voice. The terminal buzzed with impatience as Gate 34 prepared for boarding. A sea of travelers surged forward at the familiar chime of the gate announcement. Business class first. Group 1, priority access, platinum tiers. Amid them, Mr. Eldridge Hayes moved with quiet precision, his presence oddly unassuming but undeniable. He stood out not because he tried to, but because he didn't. A tall, elderly black man in his late 70s, his frame still upright despite the gentle curve in his back. He wore a windbreaker faded at the seams, khaki trousers held in place by an old brown belt, and a plain olive cap pulled low, casting a shadow over his thoughtful eyes. In one hand, he held a cane dark, polished wood with a hand-carved handle that had clearly seen decades of use. In the other, a weathered leather satchel dangled from his wrist, its strap repaired more than once. As he reached the front of the boarding line, the gate agent hesitated for just a beat. She scanned his pass but said nothing. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. No welcome, no warmth, just a flick of the wrist and a gesture toward the jet bridge. Stepping into the aircraft, Eldridge was immediately enveloped in the manufactured chill of climate-controlled air. The lighting overhead was dim but sterile, and the scent of lemon disinfectant clung to the cabin. Plush seats lined the business class area, wider than average, spaced apart with elegant touches meant to suggest exclusivity. He walked slowly, deliberately down the narrow aisle, careful not to bump the armrests with his cane. As he passed the first few rows, eyes followed him, quick glances, then lingering ones. A man in a navy pinstripe blazer looked up from his laptop, expression unreadable. A young couple whispering in row 2 stopped mid-sentence as he passed. A woman adjusted her handbag, clutching it slightly tighter. Eldridge said nothing. He kept his eyes low, searching for 4A. When he arrived, he paused. The seat was by the window. A pillow and folded blanket were arranged neatly. He adjusted the satchel beneath the seat in front of him, then slowly eased himself down with the practiced rhythm of someone whose knees no longer moved like they used to. The cane he rested against his thigh, angled toward the wall. His breathing steadied. For a moment, it was peaceful. That moment didn't last. From the galley, 2 flight attendants watched. Chloe stood with perfect posture, her blonde hair pulled back tight, a silver name tag pinned crisply above her chest. She glanced toward him, then back at her device. Her lips pressed into a line. A soft breath. She turned to her younger colleague and murmured something under her breath. The other woman smirked, covering her mouth with her hand. Then Chloe approached the cabin. She moved with professional ease, scanning seat numbers, offering polite nods to passengers she deemed worthy of acknowledgement. When she reached Eldridge, she paused. Without saying a word, she retrieved a sanitizing wipe and gently but deliberately cleaned the buckle of his seatbelt. Then the armrest. She didn't look at him once. He turned toward her slightly, puzzled, his brow raised, but she had already turned away. The message was clear. You are not welcome here. A few minutes later, as more passengers filed in, Chloe returned. She offered warm towels to a pair of white-haired women in row 3, bending low, chatting briefly with charm and grace. Then she knelt to speak with the middle-aged man across the aisle from Eldridge, her hand resting lightly on his arm as they laughed about a delayed boarding call. Not once did she glance back at Eldridge. He sat still, hands folded neatly, staring ahead. Then came the tea service. Chloe made her way down the aisle with a tray, offering ceramic mugs filled with hot chamomile or Earl Grey. She smiled at each recipient, asked about milk, honey, lemon. When she arrived at Eldridge's row, she didn't stop. Her eyes slid past him as if his seat were empty. She moved to the passenger beside him, poured the tea with finesse, then carried on. Eldridge turned his head slightly toward the window. He didn't frown. He didn't sigh. He merely watched the reflection of the inside cabin bounce against the tarmac outside. His knuckles rested on his lap, speckled with age, veins pronounced beneath thin skin. A long, pale scar stretched across his right thumb, catching the light whenever he moved. The frigid edge of Chloe's earlier gestures hadn't left him, nor had the lingering heat of humiliation that burned deeper with every passing moment of deliberate exclusion. He adjusted the hem of his jacket slightly, a practiced movement done not out of discomfort, but routine, something to center his presence in a space that tried its best to erase him. As the engines rumbled to life beneath the fuselage, the seatback screens around him flickered on in waves. Bright logos of Air's in-flight entertainment system filled the cabin with motion and color. Row by row, passengers tapped at their screens, scrolling through movie selections, games, and flight trackers with ease. All except one. Mr. Hayes extended a careful finger and pressed the center of his monitor. Nothing. The screen remained black. He tapped again, once, twice, still no response. A slight frown touched his brow. He glanced around and noticed every other screen fully active. A child 2 rows behind him was already watching a cartoon, its volume barely audible. The man across the aisle had begun a documentary on global finance. A couple nearby scrolled through the wine list on the screen's menu. Mr. Hayes leaned forward and pressed the call button above him. The soft chime registered in the cabin. Moments later, a young attendant appeared, one he hadn't seen before, likely from coach class, redirected forward as a runner. She approached with a practiced smile that thinned when her eyes met his. "Yes, sir?" she asked, her voice light but clipped. Mr. Hayes gestured politely toward his screen. "It's not responding," he said softly. The attendant leaned in, tapped once, twice, then straightened. "Some screens are undergoing maintenance this week. It's affecting a few seats. I'm afraid we can't resolve it mid-flight." Then she stepped back and disappeared into the galley without asking if he wanted a printed menu or offering alternatives. Mr. Hayes sat back slowly. He said nothing, didn't protest. But he looked down at the blank screen again, seeing more than just pixels. He saw intentionality. 10 minutes later, the smell of reheated entrees filled the cabin: garlic, thyme, citrus glaze, the usual choreography of upscale airline cuisine. The service cart glided into the aisle, Chloe now at its helm, flanked by the same junior attendant who had visited Mr. Hayes moments ago. They worked in coordinated silence, offering dishes on linen-lined trays to passengers with a smile and gentle commentary. "Seared salmon or grilled chicken, sir? Would you prefer the seasonal couscous or the risotto, ma'am?" The food was hot, aromatic, well-plated, garnished. As they reached row 4, Chloe's demeanor didn't shift. She leaned toward the man in 4B and offered a list of options. He selected the chicken, asked for red wine. Chloe smiled, served him, then turned to Mr. Hayes. Without asking, she placed a tray in front of him. No explanation, no choices, just a tray. He looked down. What met him was not what had been described in the pre-flight menu tucked into the seat pocket. Instead of a plated entree, he saw a white plastic bowl filled with watery, gelatinous porridge. Next to it sat a sealed bottle of room-temperature water and a napkin with a plastic spoon resting on top. A small sticker was affixed to the tray's edge. "Soft diet meal per passenger record." Mr. Hayes didn't move, didn't reach for the spoon. Chloe didn't meet his eyes. She turned to the next row and moved on. The man in 4B glanced sideways, eyebrows raised, clearly aware of a disparity, but unsure if it was his place to speak. He looked forward again and cut into his chicken. Mr. Hayes stared at the tray in front of him for a long time. He picked up the sticker and examined it. His medical record? What medical record? He had no dietary restrictions, no allergies, no limitations, no notes in his profile, and he had not requested anything but a standard meal when booking this flight, just as he had done for decades. He reached up and pressed the service button again. The same soft chime rang out. It stayed lit for 3, 4, 5 minutes. No one came. By the 6th minute, the button's light dimmed automatically, reset by the system. Chloe passed by a moment later, stopping only briefly to refill for BS wine glass. Mr. Hayes turned slightly toward her and spoke low and even. "Excuse me, I didn't request this meal." Chloe smiled in that hollow way he'd already come to recognize. "I understand, sir, but it's what was recorded in the system. I'm afraid there's nothing we can do about it at this point." And just like that, she moved on. The statement wasn't an explanation. It was a wall. It was final. Mr. Hayes stared ahead. He could feel the stares, not direct, not hostile, but lingering, curious, quietly judging. In the closed world of a premium cabin, disruptions didn't have to be loud to be effective. One altered tray, one blank screen, one missing choice. These were signals. They were declarations. He had entered a space designed to remind him of where others thought he belonged. And this was how they said it, without raising their voices. Outside the window, the sky had darkened into a deep blue, the cloud cover thick. Mr. Hayes's reflection appeared faintly in the plexiglass, warped by the curve of the fuselage. He looked older there, smaller, more alone. He didn't touch the food. He sat still, hands folded, eyes heavy with thoughts that had no place to go. Behind him, a group of young passengers had begun to laugh. Not loudly, not directly, but there was something in their rhythm, repeating glances, restrained chuckles, that struck familiar chords in Mr. Hayes's memory. He didn't have to hear the words. He knew their shape. Around him, the cabin blossomed with ease. Attendants chuckled with passengers over refilled drinks. People scrolled through movies and messages. And meals were cleared away with the kind of practiced rhythm that made it all seem seamless. But nothing about Mr. Hayes's experience was seamless. Each interaction had cut cleaner than the last, and yet he had said nothing. He had not moved, not protested, not raised his voice. Silence had become his only weapon, though even that was beginning to feel dull. Chloe appeared again, moving with that same professional glide, the same carefully calculated demeanor. This time, she held a clipboard in one hand and a small pen in the other. Her face wore that mask, just enough warmth to avoid confrontation, not enough to invite conversation. She stopped at Mr. Hayes's row and addressed him with calm detachment. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "for FAA compliance, we're asking select senior passengers to complete a brief safety confirmation form. It's a standard procedure for travelers of a certain age to ensure your comfort and well-being in flight." She handed him the clipboard as if it were routine, an administrative formality. Mr. Hayes looked down at the paper in front of him. Bold letters at the top read, "Senior Passenger Safety Confirmation." Below that, a series of questions. Do you require assistance during emergency procedures? Have you experienced confusion or dizziness during recent travel? Are you able to independently fasten and unfasten your seatbelt? The language was careful, but the intent was not. No other passenger had received such a form. He had watched the cabin closely since takeoff. There were older passengers in business class. One woman behind him wore compression stockings and used a neck brace, but none of them had been approached with forms. Mr. Hayes slowly looked up at Chloe, eyes narrowed slightly. "Is this required?" he asked, his voice low, stripped of emotion. Chloe gave a polite smile. "It's encouraged, Mr. Hayes. It helps us tailor in-flight support to your needs." The words were empty. Her tone was final. He took the pen, wrote his name at the top, and set the clipboard on the armrest between them without answering a single question. Chloe accepted it without comment. She turned and walked away, the clipboard held at her side like a report card waiting for review. Mr. Hayes adjusted the cap on his head and exhaled through his nose, slow and steady. His patience had deep roots, but roots could wither in dry soil. From the galley, two attendants whispered behind the curtain. One of them, a young man with cropped blonde hair, angled his phone discreetly toward row 4. He zoomed in on the cane leaning against Mr. Hayes' seat. The lighting caught the hand-carved handle, making it gleam. With a subtle tilt of his hand, the young attendant snapped a photo, then turned away. On his phone, he tapped into the crew's private chat and attached the image. The message read, "Heads up, carrying vintage weapons now." It was a joke meant for insiders, but the damage had already been done. In the cabin, the image circulated silently, flying faster than any beverage cart. Chloe received the photo just as she returned to her station. Her smirk was brief, but unmistakable. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Across the aisle, a business traveler turned slightly in his seat, glancing toward Mr. Hayes with subtle wariness. No alarm, just a shift, a recalibration of how he viewed the man in seat 4A. Mr. Hayes didn't notice the photo. He couldn't hear the group chat, but he could feel the temperature drop. Social air, once indifferent, had grown colder. A few minutes later, an older attendant appeared and asked Mr. Hayes if he needed help retrieving anything from his overhead bin. The offer was laced with suggestion, a check to see if he could even reach it. Mr. Hayes declined with a nod. Moments later, Chloe returned, ostensibly to check trash, but really to hover. She stopped at his row, lowered her voice. "We'll be doing a brief walkthrough to confirm assistive device policies. Please let us know if your cane is purely for mobility, or if it has any mechanical components or sharp fixtures. It's standard now with TSA guidelines. Just checking." The line was rehearsed. She didn't make eye contact. Mr. Hayes' jaw tensed. He slowly turned toward the cane and then looked back at her. "It's wood," he said, "and older than this airline." Chloe nodded, scribbled something onto her manifest, and left. The man across the aisle leaned forward slightly. He was in his late 40s, wearing wireless earbuds, but he'd caught enough of the exchange to realize it didn't sit right. Still, he said nothing. Few did. Silence was always the easier choice, especially when power moved politely. Mr. Hayes closed his eyes again, leaning back, but not in rest. His face was calm, but the lines around his mouth had hardened. He had known cruelty dressed as policy before. He'd seen it during boarding school inspections in Mississippi, under the white gloves of bus terminals in Detroit, and during whispered conversations in hotels where his reservation had vanished. This was not new, but it still stung. She carried with her a small package, an ordinary white napkin she had soaked in a foul-smelling liquid before boarding, carefully concealed beneath her hand. Approaching Eldridge's seat, she bent slightly and discreetly slipped the napkin between his seat cushion and armrest, leaving it wedged out of sight. As she straightened, a thin smile tugged at her lips, a secret weapon tucked away for later use. Moments passed before she casually announced, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, that there was a peculiar odor detected in the business class cabin. The comment was vague, indirect, but effective. Heads turned, noses twitched. Whispered conversations spread quietly, casting glances toward Eldridge's row. The package had done its work. Meanwhile, Eldridge felt the faint but unmistakable shift. The air around him seemed heavier, not just from the recycled pressurized atmosphere, but from the weight of judgment. His gaze flicked toward Chloe, who now busied herself elsewhere, radiating an innocent air that masked her calculated cruelty. Her eyes met his for a brief instant, a flash of triumph in the depths before she looked away. Across the aisle, a young businessman adjusted his collar and shifted slightly, subtly distancing himself. Eldridge settled back, letting out a slow breath as he fought back a rising urge to confront this manufactured injustice. Instead, he concentrated on steadying his breathing, on quieting the turmoil inside. Soon after, Chloe returned to Eldridge's seat with a disinfectant spray bottle, claiming it was part of a new, intensified cleaning protocol in response to potential contaminants. She lifted the armrest and sprayed generously along the seam, the pungent scent filling the small space around Eldridge's seat. The odor was sharp and chemical, an assault on the senses that contrasted bitterly with the soft hum of the engines. Eldridge coughed slightly but didn't protest. His hands gripped the cane tightly, knuckles widening. He glanced at the passengers around him. Some had paused their conversations, others exchanged glances but looked away quickly, unwilling to get involved. Chloe's next move was even more subtle. She approached the cockpit intercom and pressed the button. Her voice carried across the cabin, calm and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the inconvenience, but due to an isolated incident involving a potential contamination in business class, we will be conducting a thorough sanitation once we reach cruising altitude. We ask for your patience and understanding." The announcement was vague, but it sent ripples through the cabin. Passengers whispered among themselves, speculating about the nature of the incident. All eyes turned subtly, repeatedly, toward Eldridge. Later, a junior crew member stationed near the galley was seen snapping a photo of Eldridge's seat with the spray bottle still visible nearby. The photo was sent to the crew's private chat, accompanied by laughing emojis and a caption reading, "Operation Mystery Stain underway." In the glow of his screen, the image of Eldridge's seat became a symbol of targeted harassment. Throughout this ordeal, Eldridge remained outwardly composed. He did not shout. He did not accuse. He simply endured, his body a quiet fortress against the barrage of indignities. Yet his spirit, tempered by a lifetime of similar battles, remained unbroken. The staged incident was clear, a ploy to isolate him further, to make his presence a source of discomfort and suspicion. It was harassment wrapped in the guise of protocol, wielded by those who believed themselves above reproach. The faint chemical smell from the earlier sanitation still lingered faintly in the air around his seat, mingling with an undercurrent of whispered conversations and sideways glances from nearby passengers. Chloe moved through the cabin with her usual polished professionalism, but there was a new edge to her movements, a calculated confidence born from the previous staged incident that had effectively isolated Eldridge further from the rest of the passengers. She knew her audience now, passengers tuned to pick up the smallest cue, waiting to see how this quiet figure would respond to the invisible walls closing in around him. As she neared row 4 again, Chloe lifted the microphone on her service cart and announced in a clear, polite voice that echoed through the cabin, "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to thank you for your patience during our ongoing sanitation procedures. We also want to acknowledge the presence of one of our senior travelers who may require additional assistance throughout the flight. Please feel free to offer your help if you notice he needs anything." The announcement was innocent enough on the surface, but its implications rippled instantly through the cabin. Eldridge's gaze shifted subtly toward the speakers, a flicker of pain crossing his features. The subtle innuendo that he was somehow vulnerable, fragile, in need of assistance beyond what other passengers required, was not lost on anyone. Eyes darted toward him, some sympathetic, some skeptical, and a few sharp with thinly veiled judgment. Chloe returned to Eldridge's row moments later with a placard in her hand. It was a small laminated card attached to a plastic holder, emblazoned with bold black letters reading "Passenger requires special assistance." Without offering any explanation or asking for permission, Chloe affixed the placard securely to the back of Eldridge's seat, facing the passengers behind him. Eldridge, noticing the sudden display, gently removed the placard, folding it neatly and setting it aside on the fold-out table. But Chloe was relentless. A few moments later, she returned with a thin zip tie and, with a practiced hand, reattached the placard, this time more firmly, ensuring it wouldn't be easily removed. Eldridge sighed quietly, the weight of the label pressing down on him far more than the physical presence of the placard. The message was clear. He was to be seen differently, as someone marked, someone to be watched and possibly pitted. Nearby passengers had begun to whisper, their voices low but charged with curiosity and unease. A mother shifted her child closer. A businessman straightened his tie and cast a quick glance over his shoulder, and a group of young professionals exchanged smirks barely concealed behind polite smiles. Eldridge's face remained calm, but his eyes betrayed the sadness he felt, the sting of being singled out not for any action, but simply for existing in this space. As the flight attendants continued their service, Chloe continued to circulate with subtle reminders of Eldridge's special status. She offered him the softest blanket available, far thinner than those given to other passengers. When she poured water for the row, she deliberately placed his glass on the edge of the tray table, risking a spill. She leaned in close one time, speaking softly enough for only Eldridge to hear, suggesting he might want to notify the crew if he felt dizzy or unwell during the flight. The remark was a thinly veiled assertion of his frailty, another notch in the list of reasons why he did not belong here in the eyes of the crew and some passengers. Eldridge did not respond. He simply nodded slightly, his hands folded in his lap. The humiliation had become a steady, unrelenting force. Overhead, the reading lights clicked on one by one. Passengers settled into their own worlds, some flicking through magazines, others tapping quietly on tablets. But around Eldridge, a bubble of exclusion persisted. His tray remained mostly untouched, the untouched porridge a symbol of his quiet isolation. He had long since learned that resistance only invited further scorn, that his silence was both shield and prison. Through it all, Eldridge found himself reflecting on the years of his life, times of open battle, moments when he had stood firm and demanded dignity, and times when survival meant stoic endurance. This flight was a different kind of fight, one waged not with loud words or angry protests, but with small, calculated slights meant to erode his spirit. He allowed his eyes to close briefly, not in sleep, but in meditation. A small group of passengers near the front had begun to notice the disparity. An elderly woman whispered to her companion, a man in a sharp suit who nodded slowly. Their expressions were kind, but tinged with discomfort at the unspoken rules of exclusion. Chloe, ever watchful, moved strategically through the cabin, leaning in here and there to speak in hushed tones to select passengers seated near Eldridge. At one point, she approached a woman 2 rows behind, a well-dressed executive with a small notebook open on her lap. Chloe's words were soft but deliberate, intended only for the woman's ears, yet laden with implication. The woman's eyebrows knitted together in concern, her eyes flicking toward Eldridge before she nodded almost imperceptibly. From another corner, a middle-aged man, dressed in a crisp white shirt and navy blazer, was approached by Chloe and given a brief explanation in a similarly quiet voice. The man shifted uncomfortably, crossing his arms and glancing toward Eldridge's row several times. None of these interactions were overt or accusatory. Rather, they were gentle nudges designed to plant seeds of doubt and wariness in the minds of those seated nearby. Eldridge felt the weight of these orchestrated whispers, even without hearing the exact words. The subtle turning of allies into observers and perhaps eventual avoiders was a tactic honed by Chloe and her team to isolate him socially. Elsewhere in the cabin, a young woman with tightly curled hair and bright eyes listened intently as another attendant relayed similar comments about Eldridge, framed carefully as concerns for the comfort and safety of all passengers. The young woman looked toward Eldridge, her expression unreadable but thoughtful. As the minutes ticked by, more passengers began to shift their seats, rearranging their belongings and subtly putting space between themselves and row 4. One man quietly packed his laptop into his briefcase and moved to the seat across the aisle, citing an allergy to strong scents, despite no visible discomfort. A businesswoman a row ahead pulled her coat tighter around her, subtly turning her body away. Even the child seated nearby asked a parent to be moved to another seat. Eldridge watched these movements with a quiet sadness. He knew this behavior well, an unspoken social verdict delivered without confrontation, a form of rejection as ancient as it was effective. He closed his eyes briefly, breathing deeply to quell the rising sting of loneliness. Across the aisle, Chloe took care to ensure the service was impeccable for other passengers, her smile bright and rehearsed as she poured wine and offered dessert menus. Yet every so often, her gaze flickered toward Eldridge, the faintest hint of satisfaction betraying her calm exterior. In the galley, crew members shared knowing looks and exchanged silent nods, their camaraderie bolstered by the collective effort to maintain the unspoken order. on a small tablet tucked into her vest. Chloe monitored a private chat filled with messages that included references to Eldridge. Watch the guy in 4. He's got that old-school Kane, sketchy vibe. Keep eyes sharp. None of this was official, none of it documented, but it reinforced the atmosphere of suspicion and exclusion. Eldridge's thoughts drifted to the times when community was a source of strength rather than a weapon. He recalled the neighborhoods, the church gatherings, the laughter and solidarity that had once lifted him. Now, surrounded by luxury and privilege, he was marked not by achievement or dignity, but by quiet alienation. He looked down at his hands resting on his cane. The wood was cool and smooth, a tactile reminder of his long journey. The cane was more than a mobility aid. It was a symbol of resilience, of history carried forward. Yet in this cabin, it had become an emblem of otherness, something to fear or mock. The hours passed, and the cabin lights dimmed further to simulate evening. Passengers settled into sleep or distraction, but the social distance around Eldridge remained unbridgeable. A stewardess approached with a gentle smile and asked if he would like a blanket. Eldridge accepted with a nod, but the blanket offered was thin and scratchy, a noticeable downgrade from the thick, plush ones distributed to others. He wrapped it carefully over his shoulders, grateful for the warmth, but conscious of the disparity. As the night deepened, Eldridge remained awake, a quiet witness to the patterns of exclusion so skillfully woven around him. The low murmur of the cabin was punctuated only by the soft sounds of pages turning, whispered conversations, and the occasional clink of glass. Yet, beneath the surface, the currents of judgment and rejection swirled. Eldridge's gaze drifted to the window, watching the endless sky and stars pass by. Around him, the soft murmurs of passengers settling into the night filled the air, but a distinct bubble of coldness seemed to cling to his corner of the cabin. The subtle social alienation had grown into a palpable tension, and Chloe was intent on escalating the discomfort into a form of punishment carefully disguised as routine service. She approached his seat carrying a small folded towel, noticeably thinner and rougher than those distributed to the rest of the cabin, labeled as a medical support cloth. With a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes, she offered it to Mr. Hayes, suggesting it might provide added comfort for his neck or arms. Eldridge accepted silently, draping the cloth over his shoulders, the texture scratching against his skin, an unwelcome contrast to the plush surroundings. Not satisfied, Chloe moved next to his seat and gently lifted his headrest pillow. She removed it entirely, explaining softly that it was being sent to the galley for immediate sanitation due to standard hygiene protocols for certain seats. No replacement was offered. Eldridge sat with the bare leather behind his head, feeling the hardness press uncomfortably as his shoulders slumped slightly. She then bent to place a small packet of disinfectant wipes on his fold-out tray, something she had not done for any other passenger. The packet was brightly colored and overtly clinical, carrying a label that read for personal hygiene and sanitization use only. Eldridge did not touch it. A faint flutter of whispers arose among the nearby passengers. A woman in row 3 leaned to whisper something to her companion, both glancing toward Eldridge with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. The whispered comments seemed to circulate invisibly, like an unseen current pulling people away from him. Meanwhile, Chloe busied herself with the rest of the cabin, ensuring that the champagne flutes were filled and dessert menus distributed, but her eyes flicked toward Eldridge every so often, the faintest smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. As the minutes ticked by, she returned with a water glass and deliberately placed it precariously at the edge of his tray table, so close to the fold that it seemed only a slight movement would send it crashing to the floor. Eldridge noticed immediately but said nothing, carefully adjusting the glass to a safer position without drawing attention. Then came the subtle but cruelest gesture of all. Chloe whispered to him, low enough that only he could hear, suggesting that if he felt dizzy or unwell at any point, he should not hesitate to call the crew for assistance. The tone was patronizing, implying frailty and helplessness. Eldridge nodded slightly but did not speak. He understood the message clearly. Here, among these seats of privilege and power, he was being marked as weak and incapable, a burden rather than a guest. Yet despite the growing discomfort and humiliation, Eldridge remained composed. His hands rested on his cane, fingers curled around the smooth, worn wood. He inhaled deeply, centering himself amid the swirling storm of isolation. Outside the window, clouds drifted slowly across the night sky, illuminated faintly by the glow of the moon. The flight was long, and the hours stretched ahead with the weight of this quiet cruelty pressing upon him. Nearby passengers seemed increasingly eager to disengage, retreating into their own worlds of entertainment and conversation, while Eldridge sat quietly at the center of a social void. He felt the invisible walls closing in, constructed not with bricks or mortar, but with carefully choreographed acts of discomfort and exclusion. Yet within him, a steady flame of resilience burned. He had faced exclusion before in many forms, and though the pain was fresh, the spirit remained unbroken. In the galley, Chloe exchanged glances with other crew members, her confidence bolstered by the successful escalation of the subtle torment. On a small screen tucked into her vest, messages buzzed through the private staff chat, filled with emojis and brief comments celebrating their effective isolation techniques. Chloe was prepared to escalate the harassment into a more visible, permanent mark, a branding that could not be ignored by the passengers or the crew. She approached his seat carrying a small sheet of brightly colored stickers, the kind typically used to mark luggage or special service requests. But these bore a specific, coded symbol that only airline staff would recognize: a bright orange triangle with a black exclamation point. With a practiced hand, Chloe peeled one from the sheet and affixed it firmly to the armrest of Eldridge's seat, just within view of the aisle and the passengers seated behind him. The sticker was subtle enough not to alarm an uninformed traveler, but clear to the initiated. It meant seat under observation, or passenger requiring attention in airline lingo. Eldridge noticed immediately. He reached up with a slow, deliberate movement to peel the sticker away, but Chloe was quick to notice. She intercepted his hand with a light but firm grasp and whispered in a tone that brooked no refusal, "Please keep that in place. It helps us provide appropriate service." His fingers lingered on the edge of the sticker, hesitant, before he allowed her to release his hand. The physical mark on his seat was more than just a sticker. It was a visual symbol of his otherness, a flag placed upon him to distinguish him from the rest of the cabin. But Chloe's marking did not end there. Moments later, she returned carrying a small handheld device, which she pressed against the small display screen embedded in the headrest of Eldridge's seat. The screen flickered briefly before switching to a deep red background emblazoned with white text: "Seat under observation. Internal use only." The screen remained locked, showing no entertainment options, no flight information, nothing but the stark warning. Eldridge's face tightened with quiet frustration, but he said nothing. The visual branding was meant to shame, to single him out unmistakably, and it succeeded. Passengers nearby glanced toward his seat with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The sticker caught the eye of a young woman seated 2 rows behind. She nudged her companion and whispered something, both casting looks at Eldridge that were not neutral. The social distance between him and the rest of the cabin became a physical gulf, widened and marked by these small but telling symbols. Chloe circulated the cabin with a confident air, occasionally shooting a glance toward Eldridge's row to ensure the sticker and screen remained intact. In the crew's private chat, the images of the marked seat were shared along with amused commentary. Some crew members praised the clear signage, while others joked about the orange flag becoming the new trend. Meanwhile, Eldridge sat quietly, his mind racing through memories of past indignities, times when he had been branded and categorized by others' fears and prejudices. The flight was a microcosm of that larger world, a place where symbols mattered as much as words, where the smallest mark could define one's worth. As he folded his hands over his cane, Eldridge realized that the sticker and lock screen were more than mere signs. They were tools of control, devices meant to ensure his invisibility within the community of passengers. He could not entertain. He could not relax. He was watched, labeled, and contained. Yet even as the weight of these marks pressed upon him, Eldridge held fast to his composure. He was a man forged in adversity, tempered by years of silent resistance. The branding was a wound, but not a fatal one. He closed his eyes briefly, recalling the faces of those who had stood with him through the years, the strength passed down through generations. Around him, the hum of the plane was steady, unchanging. The stars outside the window wheeled silently through the night sky, indifferent to the dramas unfolding within the cabin. Yet Eldridge had endured them all in silence, his expression calm, almost unreadable. As the seatbelt sign chimed on, signaling the imminent landing, a quiet commotion stirred near the front of the cabin. For individuals dressed in tailored gray suits and carrying discreet but authoritative badges, entered the business class area with a deliberate purpose. Their presence commanded immediate attention. Passengers who had been quietly observing Eldridge turned their heads, curiosity piqued. These were not ordinary crew members or airport staff. Their demeanor spoke of power, influence, and command. The tallest of the group approached Eldridge's row with measured steps. He removed his cap in a gesture of respect and bowed slightly, an act that transcended protocol and conveyed deep acknowledgement. "Mr. Hayes," the man said, voice calm but unmistakably commanding. "We have come to escort you." Eldridge nodded once, rising slowly with the aid of his cane. There was no need for further words. The room seemed to hold its breath. Passengers who moments before had glanced at him with suspicion now looked on with a mixture of awe and deference. The suited men moved with practiced efficiency, helping Eldridge gather his belongings with quiet respect. Chloe, who had maintained a facade of authority throughout the flight, stood frozen near the galley, her face pale and eyes wide with disbelief. The final confirmation had arrived. No longer could she deny the truth behind the quiet figure she had so meticulously harassed. As Eldridge prepared to stand, one of the men gestured toward the sleeve of his jacket. There, barely visible beneath the cuff, was a gleaming emblem, a rare Air founding medal, awarded to only a handful of individuals in the company's history. The symbol was a silent testament to his legacy and authority. Passengers whispered among themselves, piecing together the reality that had remained hidden throughout the flight. This was no ordinary traveler. Eldridge Hayes was a man of immense influence, a founding pillar of the very airline they all trusted. The irony of Chloe's relentless cruelty in the face of his stature was not lost on anyone. Without a word, Eldridge allowed himself to be escorted toward the front exit of the plane. The suited men flanked him with quiet protection. The cabin, once a theater of exclusion, had transformed into a gallery of recognition. The whispers shifted from suspicion to respect and even admiration. Chloe's smirk had vanished, replaced by a haunted realization of the magnitude of her misjudgment. Her colleagues avoided her gaze, the weight of collective shame settling over the crew. Outside, ground staff awaited the arrival of the passengers. The executive team's presence was unmistakable, and Eldridge was treated not as a mere passenger, but as a VIP returning to his domain. A discreet camera crew, part of the airline's internal communications, recorded the moment with reverence. Eldridge's quiet dignity was captured for posterity, a stark contrast to the earlier scenes of silent suffering within the cabin. As the plane's door opened, sunlight flooded the aisle. Eldridge stepped onto the jet bridge, supported by the men who represented the airline's highest echelon. Passengers watched through the windows, some taking photos, others simply absorbing the spectacle. The long journey of subtle humiliation and isolation had culminated in an unspoken but undeniable truth. The man they had scorned was their greatest patron and leader. The hum of the jet engines softened as the plane touched down smoothly on the tarmac, tires skimming against the runway with a gentle but resolute friction that echoed the closing chapter of a long and silent battle. Inside the cabin, a palpable shift had already taken place since Eldridge Hayes was escorted toward the exit by the team of stern, yet respectful executives. The once subtle acts of exclusion, the invisible walls built by whispered doubts and cold gestures, had been lifted, exposing the raw truth beneath the carefully crafted facade. As the passengers disembarked, the atmosphere was thick with a new kind of tension, one born not from suspicion or prejudice, but from the inevitable reckoning that follows injustice exposed. Chloe remained seated near the galley, her composure fractured, eyes darting anxiously as murmurs swirled around her. Her colleagues avoided direct eye contact, their faces tight with discomfort. The private messages exchanged earlier, once filled with amusement at Eldridge's expense, had ceased abruptly. News of the man's identity had spread swiftly through the airline's internal channels, and more alarmingly for Chloe, beyond them. Within hours, video clips captured discreetly by fellow passengers had surfaced online, shared across social media platforms, with hashtags demanding accountability. The story of the elder man, humiliated despite his towering legacy, ignited public outrage. Airline executives faced mounting pressure from both the media and advocacy groups. The leadership team that had accompanied Eldridge on the flight convened an emergency meeting immediately after landing. The tone was grave, the stakes clear. In that room, the decision was unanimous and swift. Chloe and the flight crew responsible for the targeted harassment would face immediate suspension pending a thorough investigation. The repercussions were not merely administrative. Within days, leaked reports confirmed that Chloe's certification with the Federal Aviation Administration had been revoked for abuse of authority and violation of ethical conduct. Her professional reputation, painstakingly built over years, unraveled like fragile silk caught in a storm. Interviews with former colleagues revealed a pattern of subtle discrimination, now exposed under the harsh light of public scrutiny. Eldridge Hayes, meanwhile, remained dignified but resolute. His ordeal was not just personal, but symbolic, a mirror reflecting the systemic biases that too often went unchallenged. He spoke at a private press conference organized by the airline, his voice steady and clear as he addressed the importance of respect, equality, and accountability. No one, he said, should ever be made to feel invisible or less than simply because of who they are. His words resonated far beyond the confines of the aviation industry. The airline quickly launched new training programs emphasizing diversity, sensitivity, and the critical role of empathy in service. Eldridge was invited to serve as an honorary advisor on these initiatives, a living testament to resilience and change. On a quiet evening weeks later, Eldridge received a formal letter from the airline's CEO. The letter expressed deep regret for the treatment he endured and offered a gesture of goodwill, a lifetime of complimentary flights, ensuring he would never again feel like an outsider in the skies. But more than that, it was a promise, a commitment to fostering an environment where dignity is the baseline, not the exception. The public response was overwhelming. Social media campaigns celebrated Eldridge's courage and highlighted the broader conversation about racial justice and inclusion. Conversations sparked in boardrooms and living rooms alike, catalyzing efforts to dismantle prejudice in all its subtle forms. Eldridge, ever humble, reflected on the journey with quiet wisdom. He understood that the fight for justice was ongoing and that silence in the face of cruelty was no longer an option. Yet his story also carried hope, the power of perseverance, the strength found in dignity, and the undeniable truth that change begins when the marginalized are seen and heard. In the end, the flight that sought to diminish him became the very platform from which a message of justice and respect soared. And though the skies remained vast and complex, for Eldridge Hayes, they had become a place where dignity could finally take flight. The end. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more gripping, high-stakes narratives, please give it a like and subscribe to stay updated on the latest releases. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you think of the plot and the way it unfolded? Also, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your feedback helps us craft even better stories.